All right, it is now 7 o'clock and we are going to get started. My name is Jackie, and on behalf of Cantigny Park, I want to welcome you here tonight to Civic Awareness Series. We are so incredibly grateful to have this partnership with the League of Women Voters. This is right up the alley of our benefactor, Colonel Robert R. McCormick, who was so civically minded and cared so deeply about the rights and what was going on in the community here in Wheaton, in DuPage County, and in the state of Illinois. So thank you so much for being here. A couple of quick ground rules. Tonight, if you have a question at any point during the presentation, if you could just file it into the back of your mind, write it down. We're going to save time at the very end to do question and answer. And to all of our friends on Zoom, you can use either the Q&A or the chat feature. I will be monitoring that. If you have any issues with your technology, you can't hear, can't see, let me know. We'll do our best to fix anything on our end here. And without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to our League representative, Judy.
Thanks, Jackie. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Audra. Audra Wilson has been a champion for racial and economic justice for more than 20 years as a public interest lawyer and teacher, policy shaper, community mobilizer, and experienced executive manager. Throughout her career, Audra has focused on the voices and experiences of communities of color and communities most impacted by injustice. She served as Director of Diversity Education and Outreach, as an adjunct professor at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, a policy advisor to leading candidates for the U.S. Senate, Illinois State Treasurer, and Lieutenant Governor, and is the former Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. Yay! In October 2019, Audra was appointed chair of the Cook County Commission on Women's Issues by Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. Audra is also a board member for Bucknell University and Woodstock Institute, and serves on the Illinois Commission on Poverty Elimination and Economic Security and the Illinois Commission to End Hunger, and now serves as the president and CEO of the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. So please welcome Audra.
Okay, can you hear me? Yay. Yay, it's so good to be here. So thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I just want to thank, first and foremost, Wheaton League and all my DuPage Leaguers, and we're all my Leaguers. There we go. So everybody, all my League members, thank you so much. It's really great to be just in your company, to be back, and I appreciate the invitation. And I'm also really excited that you're willing to engage in a tough but a really important conversation, so you really should be giving yourselves a round of applause, a pat on the back, because sometimes we're not comfortable talking about these sorts of things, and the fact that you're here really speaks a lot. So I am the head of the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, and we are a nearly 60-year-old organization, anti-poverty organization that was born out of the war on poverty. And if you hear the Shriver name, it is, yes, Robert Sergeant Shriver, who is the founder of the Shriver Center. And our mission is to eliminate systemic barriers that keep families mired in poverty and to create pathways for economic stability. And so I want to just stop for a second and let you know why it's so important about this fight to counteract poverty in America and why this is so critical. So sometimes it doesn't feel like this, but this is a pretty young country, relatively speaking. And yet, in the last 50 years alone, we've made some amazing progress in terms of innovations. Like, we're seeing the invention of the internet. We've seen huge gains that are made in health. So, for example, infant mortality rates and deaths from heart disease have fallen by nearly 70%. The average American over the last 50 years has gained almost 10 years of life. And even now, we're starting finally, a bit belatedly, but still starting to recognize climate change as an existential threat. So notwithstanding all of that, when it comes to poverty, there's still been so little progress that has been made, all right? So let's do some ground setting and level setting, because I'm really big on making sure people are with me and they understand the kind of the context of my comments. So level setting point number one, poverty in America is significant, okay? Especially in contrast to our vast wealth. Poverty transcends race and ethnicity. You may have experienced poverty at some point in time of your life. You may have been proximate to poverty. You may know people who have experienced it, who are experiencing it right now. And while it's very obvious and concentrated in urban settings where you're seeing pockets of poverty, when you are seeing people who are unhoused and in the streets, and you hear about it in rural settings as well, it hides itself in plain sight and in neighborhoods that may be very much like the neighborhoods that you come from, in very pristine and even wealthy communities. And that's where it's even more insidious, because you don't see it there, but I promise you it exists. It is insidious, it is audacious, and it is widespread. And so that's the level setting that we have to have. And sometimes we have this false sense of living in the United States that it's a problem over there, or it's just an isolated thing, and I promise you it is not. So last week, the New York Times had released a report that explained the supplemental poverty rate. So you've heard about the poverty rate in the US. The supplemental poverty rate accounts for the impact of government programs. So it's meant to be a more accurate measure of poverty. And poverty has increased by 12.4% last year, which surpassed the official poverty rate, which was previously 11.5%. And that's roughly 38 million people who are living in poverty. But poverty in the United States is actually very unique to poverty in other parts of the world. And even though I just told you it transcends race and ethnicity, so there's poor folks of all walks of life, it's particularly intractable in the United States because it is as a consequence of systemic barriers that were erected to keep certain groups of people marginalized and keep them mired in poverty, have prevented their ability to be able to acquire wealth and pass wealth down to their families. And so I'll give you an example, like housing. And this is one of those things where if you just look at the patterns of housing and housing discrimination, you may have lived in communities where there are what's called racially restrictive covenants. These are codified. You can go to your local library, you can look at this to see where it explicitly excludes specific people from living in a neighborhood. Okay, so this is not something that we're making up. This is incontrovertible stuff. This is our history, okay? You've heard about blockbusting and redlining and things, again, meant to keep groups of people out. That is part of our history. And interestingly, in a country where we talk about acquiring wealth, meaning having property and having land and be able to transfer that, imagine if that's now kept from you for generation after generation. So I'm giving you this sort of warm-up to bring us to this concept of anti-wokeness. Now, I know I had a pretty big title in there when I said anti-wokeness is anti-American, and some of my staffers who were looking at my speech were like, oh, what does this mean? And and do you know your audience? And I'm like, no, I know what I'm saying. So it's okay. So we're going to get into it because you guys are here, and those of you who are watching. So we've all heard this term woke, right? And this is a term that has exploded and is used in formal conversations and informal conversations. We use it colloquially when we're talking about, is she woke, is he woke, are they woke? But what we're also witnessing right now is the backlash against the concept of woke and wokeness. So much so that now we're seeing this rise of anti-wokeness, okay? And so this war has been declared. So we talk about woke capitalism as some nefarious scheme through which the woke, as a quote I have, the woke is poised to conquer America, okay? And these are from presidential candidates, by the way. And some others who've declared that the woke mind virus represents a war on the truth. And I'm quoting this, okay? So we're seeing this fight for wokeness or against wokeness in educational institutions, in corporations. It's permeated the halls of Congress, and the Supreme Court. This war on wokeness is not just rhetoric, by the way. You'll see it in policy arenas, from the distortion and subsequent attacks on critical race theory, you've heard about that, to diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. ESG, have you heard of environmental, social, and corporate governance? So for those corporations that are trying to be good corporate citizens. and to anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. So you're seeing it everywhere. Now, there are opponents who attack programs like, for example, with DEI, to fight against woke indoctrination. A certain governor of Florida, because we are nonpartisan, signed a Stop Woke Act, setting limits on what could be taught about race in schools and workplace training, banned DEI initiatives in Florida public colleges, and claimed that DEI is better viewed as standing for discrimination, exclusion, and indoctrination. And I quote. Okay? And if you're looking at the Chronicle for Higher Education, I was reading this, 37 anti-DEI bills have now been introduced in 21 states nationwide. 4 have become law. So, for example, in Texas, the Senate passed a bill forcing colleges to close their DEI offices by a 19 to 12 party line vote. Obviously, we know the decision from the Supreme Court about gutting affirmative action, and this has paved the way for more attacks on DEI. And there are nearly 70 major companies that warned that this decision could close the pipeline for highly qualified future workers and business leaders that they need to facilitate a diverse hiring pool, despite the fact that every study that has been conducted shows how having a diverse workplace, people of different walks and backgrounds, really actually increases productivity, and it's just better for business. But notwithstanding that, this is what now corporate leaders are fearing, okay? So, we know corporate diversity obviously is going to be the next domino to fall. So, what does all this mean? For us at the Shriver Center, I just told you, we are an organization that is dismantling systemic barriers that keep people mired in poverty. We know that policies and laws there are policies and laws that are created to perpetuate poverty and racial inequality. And we know that these policies and laws are rooted in institutions, structures, and systems in every single state. And even though a lot of these barriers were actually dismantled legally by the Supreme Court and the passage of what's called civil enforcement laws, so if you've heard of the Fair Housing Act or the Civil Rights Act of 1965, or for League members, the Voting Rights Act, that's an example of civil enforcement law, these barriers still exist constructively, and they continue to work against us. But instead of confronting this inequity and instead of working collectively to root it out, to disentangle it from our country, we find ourselves at a time in our country where there are certain factions that are adamant about suppressing any effort to address inequity and have gone so far to suppress discussion around it. And we are at a point where the climate of our society feels very fraught, very tense, very hostile, and as of late, violent, right? And we are swimming in this racialized rhetoric that has always existed. So let's not pretend this hasn't existed. But it hasn't been so blatantly evoked as it has been as of recent years. And to have a former president that was very happily wielding that and using it as a way to stoke the fires and stoke fear in people, and particularly among many white Americans. So that's what I mean when I say the problem with wokeness and why anti-wokeness is anti-American. Being anti-woke, in a nutshell, threatens to undermine every effort that advocates like me and advocates like all of you are making to correct the wrongs of our predecessors and to ensure economic justice for everyone. It's just in a nutshell. So let's talk a little bit more about woke, because I'm throwing a lot of terms right now. What are we really talking about when we talk about this war on wokeness, when people don't even know what woke means, right? Because when you ask the opponents, what does woke mean? They're like, and all the quotes I gave you. But no one can actually tell you what that means. And where does this backlash come from? And what are we really doing to ourselves by embracing and perpetuating this sort of ideology? So, defining some terms. So I'm going to look down my notes here. To be woke politically. So, in the Black community, simply means that someone is informed, educated, and conscious of social injustice and racial inequality. That's what woke means. Woke is not a new term. This is almost a 100-year-old term. Okay? One of its earliest uses was an historical recording of a protest song called Scottsboro Boys by Leadbelly. This is an old blues musician. And in that recording, it was a term used about staying aware of the potential for racist violence as a black person in America. It was a warning that was in a song about warning other black people to stay woke, to be aware of your surroundings. That recording was from 1930-something. So this is nothing new, okay? So this term has actually been floating around for a very, very long time. But much like many terms, things sort of catch fire contemporarily. You don't know where they come from. And then, of course, they've been misappropriated. Not only has it been misappropriated, it's been distorted to be a catch-all about anything relating to raising awareness, consciousness about racial inequality. And what is at the root of these attacks? It's just fear, right? Fear is at the base of the war of unwokeness, and why the campaign against DEI, critical race theory, or I'll call it CRT, affirmative action, and anything else related to addressing racial inequity is so widespread. And that backlash that I just mentioned, that comes from people who believe in preserving white supremacy at any cost, and they feel threatened by, and I'm a little glib at times, the browning of America. If you know anything about statistics, you'll read, like, I think the census that it says by 2030 that the United States will be a majority, I'm going to use this word just for now, but majority minority country. Okay? There will be more people statistically of color than white. And for some people, not you in this room or watching, but for some people that is a very scary thought, right? And so it's not a coincidence that all these efforts to really to disempower, to take away the narrative, to not talk about these things coincides with the time that the country is actually changing demographically, okay? So more level setting and clarification. Let's talk about diversity, right? I said DEI is under attack. What is diversity? The presence of differences within a given setting. In the workplace, that can mean differences in race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic class. It can refer to differences in physical ability. It can be veteran status, even parental status. So diversity is a huge net. It's not just about race and ethnicity. It is what makes all of us unique. So we can look here and see that you may not see many faces of color, but I can guarantee there's 10 different ways in which each and every one of you is very different. And this is actually a very diverse room depending upon how you define that, right? So equity is a process of ensuring that practices and programs are impartial, fair, and provide equal possible outcomes for every individual. Okay, that's not too objectionable. Inclusion is the practice of ensuring that people feel a sense of belonging in their workplace, right? That means that every employee feels comfortable and supported by their organization when it comes to being their authentic selves, right? So whether it's a matter of hair, whether it's a matter of some other expression, they feel like they can be in an environment where it's okay to be themselves. Okay? So when you combine these three elements, DEI, it's an ethos that recognizes the value of diverse voices and emphasizes inclusivity and employee well-being as central facets of success. And like I said earlier, so many studies, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, all these different studies that especially looked at corporate workplaces have talked about the teams that are the most highly functioning. And they are teams that are diverse in every different way you can imagine, right? Now, a little bit about CRT, okay, critical race theory. So, are there any lawyers in here? Am I the lone lawyer? That's rare. Okay, but good, I'm glad. So, critical race theory, it's an academic philosophy that originated in law school, okay, in the late 1960s. Not new, late 1960s, okay? So Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and several other Black legal scholars. And it's a framework for legal analysis, I keep stressing this, that explains how American racism has shaped public policy. And the core idea is that race is a social construct, you guys have heard that before, and that racism is not merely the product of individual prejudice, but embedded in systems and policies. What CRT is not, is making white people feel guilty. I just want to say that. I told you I can be glib sometimes, right? No. It is about what I just mentioned. It's about our systems. It's about institutional racism. It actually is not about individuals, right? It's not about any indictment of individuals. It's talking about the racism embedded in our system. And I just give you an example of housing. But we can even talk about, again, because we're league members, we talk about voting. Look at voting rights, right? And the fact that it took, almost 85 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment to have voting rights for all. We had to remove legal obstacles, right, to being able to vote, poll taxes and literacy tests and things like that, preventing our right to vote. These are things that were legal. They're de jure, right? They're constitutionally permissible, and it took a civil act to remove these. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying things are embedded, and that's what critical race theory talks about. It is not taught in K through 12. It is not indoctrination of youth. It is not talking about white people bad, everything else, nothing to do with that, okay? But through this sleight of hand, these terms and these concepts have been misappropriated. They've been weaponized, and they've been weaponized to describe the ideas that they find objectionable, okay? And that is things like white privilege, systemic inequality, and inherent bias. So opponents, this is what they don't want to hear, because that's what they think it's code speak for. Now, how does this relate to my work? It's very simple. I'm an anti-poverty advocate, right? But this backlash is really important because I just told you in the beginning, even though poverty transcends race, American poverty is unique. It is built into our systems. But if you don't believe that there is systemic racism, or you want to sanitize American history by not talking about systemic racism, then what am I doing as an advocate? What's the point of my organization? What is it that I'm trying to root out? What system am I trying to change if we don't even acknowledge that a system exists? So for me, like an attack on critical race theory is an attempt to deny our American origin story, right? And it's not pleasant. Let's just put it out there. There's a century of slavery. There is genocide of indigenous peoples. There is legalized discrimination. I told you, just look at any sort of book. You go into your library. There are horrible pieces in our history, all of us, our history, that continue to impact us contemporarily because of our unwillingness to confront them head on. And that's why I said it's so important for you to be in this room, because you are not afraid to talk about this. This is American history. I'm not making this up. It is what it is, right? So, yet and still, especially when we talk about poverty, how many of you have heard we still talk about America being the land of opportunity for anybody who works hard enough, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? And anyone can achieve anything in the United States. And my parents are immigrants. They came to the United States specifically for economic opportunity. And people might look at me because my mom's a nurse, my dad's an accountant. Before Bill Cosby messed it all up, we had a very Cosby-esque upbringing. It's kind of hard now. I'm like, ugh, but that's, because there are Black people who grow up like that. I am one of them, And my parents came here for a specific reason. So we know this is a place where there can be great economic opportunity. Notwithstanding everything I told you about our origin story, it is still an amazing country. And there is still great opportunity and possibility, right? But because we love our country so much, that's why we talk about the things that we don't like to talk about. Sometimes I make the analogy about talking about your kids. We love our kids. I have a teenage human at home. She is awesome. I love her. But sometimes she's stinky, and sometimes she's annoying, and sometimes she's whatever. But I talk about these things to her because I want her to be better, faster, stronger, successful. And so we have to talk about the bad with the good, right? And that's what we have to talk about with our own country, right? Poverty has been part of this nation since its inception, right? But I keep telling you, it is most pervasive, it is most persistent, it is most pernicious for people of color, thanks to racism, okay? Black, Indigenous, and other people of color still contend with glaring disparities in wealth, reduced life expectancy, under-resourced education, and overrepresentation in the criminal legal system. Just a fact, right? But racism, if it's not institutional but only episodic and interpersonal, then any efforts to system change becomes irrelevant. And that's why me, as an anti-poverty advocate, said, oh, no, no, no. This anti-woke thing is even worse than it sounds, because it is completely undermining my work and the work of advocates like myself that are trying to eradicate poverty in America. Okay? But in recent years, as we know, truth has become very debatable. And the more vocal we are in calling out the hypocrisy, the stronger the resistance, right? So, in fact, this pendulum, I think of it as a pendulum swinging, right? So this pendulum that has swung far away from the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm a firm believer that, this is history. It's cyclical. Things happen, and they may be long before our lifetimes. But you know when the last time this happened? It was Reconstruction. And if you think about Reconstruction and do some of your research, it was a very short window, like 11 and a half years, but some of the most significant gains were made at the end of slavery, right? Before things descended into states. And that was so you're having representation in Congress of Black people. You have just these gains that were made in this very short decade and a little bit of change window. And then after that period of Reconstruction, what came? Jim Crow, right? Almost 70 years of that. Legalized discrimination. But so I want you to see that parallel, that for me, what I see is this is another one of those places. When you have a lot of progress, again, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ movements, when you have marginalized groups that come out of the shadows and they are fighting, and then there is a public sentiment moving towards that, then the opposition will follow shortly after, because that's where the threat comes, because that means there's change and there's progress. And this is just another one of those periods, right? So what do I want you to take from just everything that I've said? And this is good because I want to open us up for some discussion, but a couple of things. As far as poverty goes, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. I'd like to claim that quote, but it's actually Brian Stevenson. So if you know Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative, so you've seen the movie, that's Brian's quote. But it is, the opposite of poverty is justice, all right? And when we think about poverty in America, you cannot ignore the inextricable link between poverty and racism. So I'm repeating myself. Repeating myself again. Anti-wokeness is about people interested in keeping the hierarchy and social inequality the way it is. And they do that by controlling our language and how people think about ideas. Anti-wokeness promotes anti-Blackness, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ, anti-anything that is not cis, white, hetero, that's, and in some instances male, okay? And anti-wokeness promotes fear and it promotes violence. And we have seen examples of this. Right? Religious-based violence, racial violence. I was doing an event in Highland Park, and as they were commemorating the anniversary of the shooting, of the work that I've seen where there's been racialized violence. This is where we are right now, and that's why words matter and this rhetoric matters. Another point to think about, minimizing, sanitizing, or rejecting the existence of racism doesn't make it vanish. Okay, so I'll say it again. Minimizing, sanitizing, or rejecting the existence of racism doesn't make it go away. Okay, it actually reinforces it, right? Because it is woven tightly into the fabric of our nation. And because it is woven so tightly, and this is something that's going to be very sobering for all of you, no one is immune from its impact. Not a single one of us standing here is immune from it, okay? We either benefit from the privileges that racism bestows, or we wrestle from the disadvantages and inequities it creates. It's one or the other. So I want you all to really understand this and walk out of here saying, whether I created it, whether I sanction it, no matter what I think about it, it has impacted me, it continues to impact me, it has shaped my life. The difference, however, is that you're aware of that. And that's what we really want people to be aware of. It's not a matter of, there's no apologies, but it's being aware and saying, now that I know this, what do I do with this knowledge? Right? Now, I'm going to flip the script for a second, because I also want people to be mindful, and I told you I'm glib, about what I call wokeness run amok. Sometimes we have this false sense of confidence in our understanding and our acknowledgement of privilege and supremacy. So I am talking to these crowds right now, and there's a little preacher choir vibe. It's like, yes, we know this. This is great. We're all in lockstep, right? And we can kind of get lulled into this sense of, hey, no, we're on the right side. We get this, Audra. We understand this. But remember what I said. No one is immune from acculturation, right? From being conditioned, from being indoctrinated with racial norms. So this means that even if you recognize and you're acknowledging the privilege, your privilege and supremacy, it doesn't mean that you may not wield it or exercise it inadvertently. Okay? And that's the piece that sometimes doesn't sit well with people, because they think, I didn't mean to do something. It was not my intent to cause harm. And sometimes when I'm talking to my white friends and counterparts, I'm like, you have to let go of this notion that you were doing something on purpose. Because when I come to you and tell you something, it's not because I think you intended to commit harm. We are indoctrinated. Here is an example of something you may not have known that is actually causing harm. And your reaction needs to be, allow me to tell you this, and to receive that knowing that I'm just telling you this because actually if I didn't care, I wouldn't tell you. But I'm telling you because I care and I want you to do better. Just like I want someone to tell me, right? But it can make conversations very tricky, and it make us feel very uncomfortable, and that's why sometimes I say it's a little wokeness run amok, because when someone calls it out, that's when you see the defensiveness saying, oh, not me, not me, not me, right? In my own organization, and I have an organization that's quite racially diverse, there are probably more people of color than not. I have a staff of almost 40, but it's a pretty nice mixture, men, women, all different walks. But I have to remind my team that there's no room for white fragility in the fight for racial justice. So you can't. How can I, if I can't talk to you guys about this, why are we doing this work? So my team's like, okay, yes, Audra, we get it. So, and for those who consider themselves progressive, I always tell them that there is no progressivism without progress. So that means sometimes you're gonna have to be in the middle of it. You're gonna stick your foot in it. It's gonna be an uncomfortable conversation. But we can't make progress if we're not willing to talk about these things, okay? But we know that outside of this room and on our video right now, because I think we're all soldiers in the same army, there are people that we all know that have a profound discomfort about having honest conversations about our country's legacy and continued conversations about racial inequity, injustice, and violence, right? We know that there needs to be a lot of work done. And this is where it's really difficult, because I can tell you guys this, and you can sympathize, and you can empathize, and you can say, Audra, right there. But at the end of the day, you're going to be in conversations where I am not. So it's easy for us to reinforce, and support each other in this room. But the real question is when you leave this room and when you're in a much more homogenous environment, and I don't mean just racially homogenous, but I mean just in terms of mentality, ideology, and you're the outsider, and you hear and you see things that you know in your gut and your heart are not right. And how do you have the courage to say, hey, that's not good. I know what you're saying, it is not right. How do you step out? Because you're going to be the outlier. And that's a lot to ask. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is easy. It's easy for me to say, oh yeah, get out there and do the right thing, but we're social creatures, and we don't want to put ourselves out there. But do understand that if we do not put ourselves out there and say something and counteract those conversations and counteract the misinformation, that's what keeps racism alive and well, right? That's what perpetuates this. And interestingly, it actually ultimately harms all of us. It really does. So I'm going to give you some resources of things that I want you to read, because I can tell you're all readers. But, there is an author named Layla Saad, and she has a book called Me and White Supremacy. So if you've read the book White Fragility, I would suggest that you actually read this book by Layla Saad, because I think it's an interesting counterpart to it, but it's a little bit more nuanced. It's like, imagine the White Fragility book, but it's written by a non-white person. And it's called Me and White Supremacy, Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor, right? And so the author, Layla, cautions against the belief that white supremacy is only upheld by a fringe group of white people. Okay? It is actually upheld by us all. And again, that's a tough thing because you see some extremism and it just repulses you. You might say, Audra, that is the most repugnant thing, and I could believe you 1,000%. But I would caution you in thinking that it's them. It's just them over there. They is not me, you know. And in some ways, they are not you. But that's also a very extreme example or manifestation, right? Much more of this is very subtle. It's very insidious. Generally speaking, notwithstanding some of the fringe people, we know in polite company what not to say, right? We know what words not to use. You know, we can wink and nod about making references, but people, you know, have been acculturated in such a way to not be so blatant about it. That's the sort of thing you have to worry about more. Not that extreme example in saying, oh, that's a fringe that is unrecognizable to me. It's the people who are much closer to you that use the code speak. That's where you have to be more mindful, okay? So Saad asked readers to unpack all their bias. And what I like about the book, too, is it really gives some tools to stop inflicting damage on the people who are closest to you, people of color, inadvertently. And so it's a really great book to read. So just summing this up so we can just open this up a bit. Among our allies in this fight, because we are all allies in this room, do understand that even those of us who are in this fight, with the best of intentions, can still do harm, and sometimes do harm. And that's why, as an advocate for economic justice, for racial justice, for social justice, we have to recognize and reckon with racism at all levels: individual, institutional, systemic, and structural. And when we do that, that's when we're going to really make some amazing progress. And that's why I love speaking to groups like this, people who are open-minded, people who are just willing to listen and to have a slightly uncomfortable conversation, to talk about difficult issues. But like I said, you're not going to always be in these circles because we are sympathetic to each other, right? But we cannot fix what we don't acknowledge. And that's what we have to be mindful of, even when we are in those rooms that are not sympathetic. And how we're going to end racism and really live up to these American ideals, because the American ideals are contrary to what's being spewed. It requires us learning and growing well beyond our comfort zone, or else we are going to be doomed to repeat those errors, and that's what we don't want, and that's why we're all here. So I'm going to stop with that and just open it up for questions or thoughts, because it's the part I like to hear what you have to say.
We're going to use the microphone so our at-home guests can also hear the questions.
Hi, my name's Laura. I kind of have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, you said we may inadvertently be doing or saying things
Yes.
that we're unaware of. Can you give us like an example of a common one that we might all be doing and not be aware of?
Sure.
And the second thing is, and I guess I want there to be an answer, but I know there probably isn't, as to how to address it. So I was in a situation where someone was complaining about reparations. Mm-hmm. And my response was, you know what, I used to think like that. And I took a class on race, a 6-week class, and I said, my mind was blown by the systemic, injustices and how, I've completely changed my mind on it because of what I've learned and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And her response to me was, oh, I don't believe in that. That's baloney. She said BS, but, and I don't know, are there key things we should say if we're ever in that situation? I know we're not going to change someone's mind in a 5-minute conversation, but
no, that's tough, and it's even more disturbing when you're like, I educated myself and I have a different perspective. It really kind of goes back to what I was saying about just history, and this is really a slightly larger answer to your question, but it's why I think, this is my own personal opinion, I think sanitizing history, taking out history of, like, the true history of, like, non-white people in the country actually really exacerbates racism. It gives you a very distorted perception of the country. It takes away your ability to appreciate the contributions of every single person, even those that were brought in bondage. It takes away your knowledge and understanding of the ingenuity of the people that you might look at that could be cleaning your floor and you don't know what sort of legacy that they've come from, right? It actually really harms all of us. So now your response to say, read a book may not go over too well, but, but I mean, it is something that you want to challenge people to read. And it was important that you say, hey, listen, I like how you use yourself as an example. I thought the same way you did. Because it lets people say like, oh, you did, so why are you different now? So some will dismiss you, but there might be someone who listens and said, really? Well, what did you learn? They'll ask you, what did you read? Where did you get this information? So you're not going to convert everybody, like you said, but talking about your own experience, talking about your own journey, letting someone who looks like you and has a similar background than you do to hear your own journey can be inspirational for some people. And again, I'll give you guys some more resources. As far as doing or saying things, they're subtle. I'm trying to give you an example. This is a little kind of slightly esoteric here, but I'm going to give you one as a CEO. So I am the head of the Shriver Center. My predecessor, I should tell you, I'm also an alum of the Shriver Center. It's my first job out of law school. The man that I replaced was the man who hired me. But I had left and then come back, right? He had been doing this work for over 30 years. Just veteran attorney, he's a beast, he's awesome, and a very salt-of-the-earth person. And actually, not only is someone I respect highly, and as a mentor, we actually just co-authored a book chapter on the Sustainable Development Goals. I wrote in like some boring treatise, but I'm proud of myself because I have a book chapter. And he was my co-author. So this is someone I respect immensely. But he is a white, 70-year-old male who'd been doing this for 40 years. And then I come along, right? And I had an organization that was like, it's interesting because there was a lot of, because there's also age. Age comes in, because now I'm a Gen Xer, and I'm seeing some age distinctions, like how we even perceive things. But a lot of the younger members of my organization really, they respected him immensely, but they're like, he's out of touch. He's got to go. We need something fresher, different. We need a person of color, because I've become very trendy, by the way. So it's like, we need a person of color. We want a person of color, and a woman of color. Great, right? So you get two things. But when I walked into the organization, and I can say this because I said this to my team, one of the first things that many of my white staffers said to me, they're like, Audra, we're so happy you're here. We're excited, you're coming back home, and you've got all this experience now. They proceeded to tell me that I was presiding over a white supremacist organization. And I was like, what? And so now these are white people telling me, they're like, we want you to know this. And I said, oh, well, what is that? I don't know how to receive it. Like, what does this mean? And so they gave me this whole explanation of what a white supremacist organization was. But two funny things happened. Number one, no one ever asked me what I thought I was presiding over. I was told. And number two, what they described, I was like, but isn't that what a CEO is supposed to do? Do we do everything by consensus? You're making HR decisions when you are supposed to be working over here. Like everything they described about power sharing, this, that, and the other, and like, that's not the kind of organization, So we're going to help you not preside over a white supremacist organization, and then proceeded to tell me exactly how I should be a CEO. And I'm like, you don't see the irony here, do you? Are you interested in knowing what I think? And they're like, well, you agree, don't you? Because we're here with you. It's white supremacists. I'm like, the executive making a decision, I didn't think that was white supremacists. I thought someone had to make a decision, right? Or else you're paying me a whole lot of money to do everything by consensus. And if I were you, I'd be really angry. If I'm like, why is she being paid so much? And we are all making decisions. I'm like, no, that's not how this works. So that's a very subtle example, but it's one of those things that we don't even recognize the privilege that we're wielding. And that me, as a brand new CEO, who happens to be a woman and happens to be a person of color, that you literally indoctrinated me by telling me what I was walking into, and then telling me how I need to be governing, and not even giving me the opportunity to give you something different. And then if I govern a little bit differently, it's like, oh. And now, I can say this now because my organization is amazing and it's transcended, but just to even show you within the organization, I had one person who's since left say that I was governing like a white male. I was like, oh. So I know I've arrived because I am now the man. By the way, any CEO, doesn't matter who you are, I walked in the doors, I became the man. So I just felt so great. I was like, really? I was like, because I made a decision and I did not include you in that final decision. I took all the information, did the assessment, did the analysis, made a final determination and said, this is what we're going to do. And now I'm the man, because it wasn't inclusive. I was like, oh, wow. So these are very subtle things. That's what I mean. Sometimes it's so subtle, but we don't realize what this is about. The other thing I'll tell you too is also about, and this is not just my organization, I see this especially a lot of nonprofits. There are a lot of people, and I speak to a lot of my colleagues, who will cloak things in equity. This is inequitable. We need to be thinking about this. We need to be concerned about this. When actually what they're talking about is themselves. So you'll see this a lot when it comes to salary. You'll see this when some sort of benefit. And I've had colleagues of mine that talk about how their staff will talk about we, and it's like, is there really a we? It's very disingenuous. You're talking about yourself. Do not cloak something in equity when you're not talking about equity. If you're saying, Audra, I want to know about my pay. I want to know if I'm going to get a raise. Please don't talk to me about the poor and downtrodden in my organization and I'm speaking on their behalf. No, you're speaking on your behalf. I'm like, so little things like that I've had to sort of, say to people, I'm like, we need to be honest and we need to be open. And when you're talking about yourself, talk about yourself. But I am very sensitive about the cloaking in equity because we are an organization that's fighting inequity. So we don't want to manufacture something that doesn't exist within our organization. Or conversely, we don't want to ignore the fact that even those of us as social justice warriors can cause harm. So I will say, the postscript to this is that my team, we've been able to have some great discussions and transcend a lot of this. And I've been able to call them out there and say, let me tell you why that's really not cool. So, and I really appreciate them for being open and saying, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I did that. And recognizing that we are indoctrinated, right? We are acculturated. No one is immune, and you can still do harm even if you don't intend to do so. And even in your allyship, you can marginalize as you did, or just forget like, hey, I'm the boss. Did you tell the white man that just preceded me what to do? Did you tell him and call meetings and tell him how he needs to be operating and what decisions he needs to be making? No. So why would you do that for me as a female and as a person of color? So.
Thank you. Jackie, are there any questions online? Okay. Please don't forget to our virtual guests that you are able to use the Q&A or chat function to ask a question. Erica.
Hi, Audra. Welcome.
Hey.
I have a million things rolling around in my head, and a conversation I just had the other day, a work conversation around language and the power of words. And so this is more of a comment, and maybe you can reflect on it. But this idea of diversifying, right, is structured in a positive way when we talk about diversify your financial planning.
Yeah.
Or diversify the organizations, or we tell our children when they go up to college, try lots of different things.
Right.
Diversify your experience, meet different people, take some calculated risks, right? All of that is a positive kind of definition or response to it, right?
Yeah.
And so I struggle with, and what's troubling is when we hear these words, and I work with middle-level leaders, senior leaders who want to do work that's great for everyone, and bring the right people in and the right talent, right? And want this language and even this idea of including people, but when you say inclusive, it's, to your point earlier, taken on this mask of what it's not meant to be. It means, do you feel like you belong? Can you speak out at a meeting? Your example of the former CEO as a male may have been for you partly, and even maybe mostly, that you are a woman in this role.
There's that too.
So I think the language piece, and I'm glad you spoke to that, is so important. And then today I read an article in the Atlantic with General Milley, who has stepped down now in his retirement, really calling out the use of the word WOKE and how that really hurt his job, what he was trying to do, supporting armed services, the work that he was doing, and just talking about how this word being co-opted. He said, I want to understand. I want to read widely. I expect my officers to do that, right? So language, the power of words, how they can be used to both help and hinder, is something that I think we all have work to do in terms of how we use words that are easy to trip off the tongue, but now mean very different things to people.
They do. You made me think of something, and I appreciate the comments. It's two things. One, it's actually kind of another answer to your question, is that I'm going to give you a trick that my executive coach gives me. When people say things about, I don't want to forget the second point. When people are challenging, or like if you got the person saying, I think that's ridiculous. My executive coach says, when people say something, because our innate response is to defend and to explain. What he does is he just flips the question back. That's interesting. Why do you say that? So in the case of diversity, like you said, diversity and all, that's so positive and affirmative in every other context, but in this one, all of a sudden it's threatening, and it's like, really, tell me why. And you'll have a couple of reactions. One is that people can't articulate it. Or they might articulate it, but they even catch themselves because they realize, like, this doesn't make me sound very good, because they'll be like, well, they'll waffle. You might have someone that's very audacious and they'll be like, because I think X. That's okay, now you know where they stand. But I find sometimes instead of explaining things to people and explaining why this is good, why this is right, you tell them, well, why is it not? Why are you on the defensive having to explain why something is right? We all know in this room why it's right. So put them on the defensive. They're like, well, that's interesting. Why would you think this is a bad thing? Let them tell you. And let them trip themselves up when they're like, Because even many of them don't want to be exposed. They don't want to be branded as a racist. They don't want to be branded as sexist. They don't want to be branded as a homophobe. They don't want to be branded in a certain way. But sometimes they have to hear their own selves and acknowledge the fact, like, why am I objecting to this? So, it's when I want to play mind games. I just smile. I have a big smile on my face, like, really? So, you have to do it in a way that you're feeling comfortable, but that's what I would encourage you to do.
I thank you for your talk. You can just hold it closer. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm 90 years old, and we've lived in many different cities, and we've been involved in diverse communities all our lives. And what I'm startled now is the last few years with diversity, equity, inclusion, critical race theory. These programs have hardened people and really created a racial problem. I've seen this in my own family. My children didn't see color growing up. They had friends, and now they're suspicious that they're being judged all the time. As an example, we have a grandson who is pre-med, and he's had internships for the last couple of years. Outstanding record and reports and reviews from his doctors. But now he's applying for medical school after a couple of years of internship. He's been told by many that he will have almost impossible chance to get into medical school because of the diversity, equity, inclusion. He's white. And I think this is tragic. And when you talk about equity, I believe in equality. Not equal outcomes, but equality to everyone to try and have equal access. But we can't be guaranteed that everyone's going to have the same outcome. So I'd like your opinion on that. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. So You said a couple of kind of really important things, kind of telling. I'm going to start backwards. I am not advocating, I mean, I'd love to see equality of outcome, but that's certainly not what I'm saying. Because there won't be equality of outcome. We're different people, right? Some people are going to go very far, some people will go kind of to the middle, some people won't go far at all. That's just the way life is. What advocates like myself and many people in this room are talking about is kind of what you had alluded to before, and that is, it's equality of access. One of the things that you said earlier that kind of struck out to me is that you're looking at yourself through the lens of how you interact with people around you, how you have taught your children, how you have, tried to teach the people around you to have that perspective. And I think it's very admirable because you don't make these sorts of distinctions with people, right? But the challenge, though, is that I am different from you. And I have a very different life experience than you. And you and I can be in a room and just have the best of conversations and really feel a connection. But even with that, there is a very different perspective that I'm going to have and very different life experiences that I'm going to have because not everybody looks at me the way you might look at me. And so what I'm really talking about is what about the circumstances and situations where I am not in the room with people like you who see beyond the color of my skin, who can appreciate me for who I am at my core, who can respect me just for the things that I say and that I do and don't filter it through a lens. And unfortunately, I think that there are a lot more people who, at least in my experience I deal with, who do see me first as a Black woman than see all the other good that I have. And that's also the problem we're talking about, just equity issues. If we were all starting at the same place, then you'd absolutely right. Outcome cannot be guaranteed and we shouldn't be pushing it. What I'm suggesting to you is that we're not all starting from the same place. And the reason why I gave a little bit of a level setting with housing and other things is that when you put barriers to keeping people from being in the same place, even when you put all these laws now in place, in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, you have to understand that, let's just use women, let's take race out for a second, right? 19th Amendment, okay? Now you have a whole bunch of women who are allowed to vote, finally. But think of all the time and the decades before that women could not vote. So you're already talking about you're being at a disadvantage because you're now being given this right that was bestowed upon even newly freed slaves who were male before women's right to vote, okay? So you're already behind. Now think several decades later before you remove the barriers that kept other people from being able to vote, okay? And that was not until the Voting Rights Act. So that's a whole century that I haven't been able to exercise that right to vote. So all of this is to say that even if you put every law out there that eliminates racism and all these things and sexism, you're now dealing, and this is someone asked about reparations, and this is where the reparations things comes in, you're talking about people who have already been harmed and generations of having been harmed. So to be very candid with you, we're not equal because I was not at the same place as you, and you can't just look at me and kind of where I'm standing here because you may not even know kind of what I've done to be here and what other obstacles I've had to endure and to move around to even be in this room with all of you. I just told you I had parents who are professionals. So I had and let me be very clear, we all have privilege. I acknowledge my privilege. My privilege is I had a nuclear family. I had parents, I grew up in Connecticut. I had parents who had means. I didn't endure a lot of the things and challenges that some people do. And I am the first one to tell you that's my privilege. I don't run away from it. I will tell you that I am privileged in that way. I don't apologize for it because I don't want to give it away. But I acknowledge it, I recognize how it's gotten me here, and now I've dedicated my life to making sure that I can wield my privilege to help those who did not have that. And that's really what I ask for all of you in here too, to understand that just because you live a certain way and see things a certain way does not mean that your experience is the same as someone else's. And I am living proof of saying I've had to jump through all sorts of barriers that you may never recognize if you're looking at me and listening to how I speak or how I present myself or how many letters I have behind my name. That doesn't tell you my life story.
All right, so we have a listener on Zoom who is wondering if the United States is different in the way that we approach these issues of diversity and inclusion and equity and overall racism than other countries. And if we are different, why are we different?
Ooh. In 30 seconds. No.
Come back for Audra's talk part 2.
Yeah, that's like part 2. That's a whole nother lecture. No, I mean, in a nutshell, yeah, of course it's different. But the U.S. is different. I mean, we are very unique. Our history is unique. I mean, from Second Amendment to the First Amendment to whatever. You almost can't compare because that's our origin story, right? So we are going to address issues of poverty very differently than our peers. Now, my parents are from Jamaica. If you know anything, like Jamaica was a colony until 1962. A lot of my cousins, my parents emigrated to the States, but many of my family emigrated to England. And you'll see racism in England, but because the history is different, how it manifests itself is different than that of the United States. So you can't have a solution that, I'm looking back to you, like you were asking the question, I'm sorry. Sorry about that, but so that's what I mean, where you can't necessarily compare, except to know that racism exists everywhere. And every place where you are has to tailor solutions according to how their country's own origin story. And just as I'm wrapping things up, to say that you have to acknowledge your origin story. And once you acknowledge your origin story, then it's easier to really fashion those solutions. One other point I want to make sure you all understand. Why does this all impact every single person in this room? Every single person? The United States, by several indicators, among the top 25 GDP countries, is behind in child poverty, right? Our healthcare system, even our income system, because people are so fearful of someone having something that they don't deserve. What's the expression, cutting off your nose to spite your face? If you haven't read Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us, because I'm giving you a reading list, The Sum of Us, S-U-M of Us, Heather McGhee, who's a native Chicagoan, wrote this amazing book, and it basically talks about how this zero-sum game that we play, we are willing to cause our own demise if we ever think someone will get something that we don't have. And if you look at the cover of her book, it has a swimming pool that's drained. The swimming pool is an analogy. It is an example of when we were talking about desegregation and allowing Black people to swim in public pools. You know what a lot of communities did? They drained the pool. Because we're not going to have any Black people swimming in our pool. Most of those pools went into private country clubs. The vast majority of us are not rich people. So now, all kids, or most of the kids, can't use the public pool. So what was the point of all that? You so wanted to keep me out that you were willing to keep half the community out? And even with the origins of slavery, do you know it's kind of this avowed, he's an unabashed racist, but he was speaking out, I forgot his name right now, but Heather McGhee talks about him, wrote this essay about slavery in the United States, how slavery was harmful to white people, right? Poor white people, because slavery was about wealthy white landowners. People in the South were not wealthy white landowners, right? And why the North looks a lot different is because we are talking about building entire systems for communities. So even though I know our educational system can be a little checkered, when you're looking at educational outcomes in the North and in the West and other places as opposed to the South, it's because there were things that were put together more for entire communities, not like land-owning wealthy people, right? So you had a lot of poor white people that were marginalized. They would not think of themselves as that, but what we do is we change the racial rhetoric and talk about them, they. Have you guys read another book, When the Irish Became White? Even the construct of being white, that's a much newer term, because many of you might come from Eastern Europe, European backgrounds, others. there were groups that came to this country of people that we now call white that were not white when they came to this country. They were marginalized and put in ghettos. They were marginalized, they were put in other places. When it became politically expedient to be white, then they became white. But the irony is they came in the turn of the century. I mean, yes, they were not brought in bondage, but they certainly were marginalized. And that's what I mean when I'm saying if you don't know your history, you are going to repeat it, right? And if you are in denial about this, you actually lose your empathy, right? Because it's like, well, wait a minute, who are we to talk about, this situation? I can look at my own families and see marginalization. I can see what happens. I see what happens when we don't talk about our history. And when we sanitize our history, we forget like, oh, no, we have come from just difficult circumstances. We needed help and government assistance. Many of us got it. How many of you got GI bills? How many of you got these other things? This was help. Why is that now vilified as welfare when you talk about a GI bill, that's not welfare? It's like, so we have to be really honest with ourselves about not changing language, not changing circumstances and situations to fit us, calling one thing something when it's a certain group of people and turning it into something negative, as you said before, when it's another. And the more we can do that and challenge those who do that, is I think the more we're going to be on that pathway to finally, eliminating the scourge of racism. So with that, I'm going to shut up. So thank you very much.
Oh, please join me in thanking Audra for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Love you.
You too.
And a round of applause for our assistants from Cantigny for hosting us here this evening. We hope you'll all join us next month on October 12th, when David Hillier will be talking about dis and mistrust in our elections. Once again, the program will be hybrid, and you can be able to sign up on the Cantigny Events website. Thank you again, Audra. As always.
Thank you. Love you too. Thank you.